Hello. Welcome back to another edition of General Strike Podcast. I'm joined by the man, the myth, the legend himself, Mr. Benjamin Norton. Ben, thank you for joining me on today's show. You are one of the best journalists out there. I mean, I don't know if you realize it. In terms of independent journalism, you're like a gold standard for a lot of us. I'm very, very excited to have you on. A lot to talk about as well. And plus, you have sort of a rebranded outlet to talk about as well. I want to give you a platform to plug Geopolitical Economic Report. Love what you're doing. Thank you for being on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's get into it because obviously a lot to talk about. The recent wave of reactionary, fascistic, counter-revolutionary activity, so to speak, in Latin America really took a head this last week in Brazil when both the presidential palace, the congressional building, and the Supreme Court were overtaken by, I think the number was around 4,000 Bolsonaro supporters. Ben, what's your overall analysis on what's happening right now in Brazil? Since obviously that attempt has been sort of quelled by Lula and state forces. I did see reports that Bolsonaro supporters were stopping or trying to take over oil refineries as well. So what's the overall class struggle looking like right now in Brazil?
Well, this was a last-ditch effort to overthrow Lula. There were many coup attempts after Lula won the election on October 30th, 2022. This wasn't the only one. This was the biggest coup attempt. But it was not just thousands of Bolsonaro supporters storming the presidential palace, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. There were also high-level officials in the military and the police and governors who are loyal to Bolsonaro who are involved in this, and some of them have been arrested. So this was, again, the last attempt at trying to prevent Lula from returning to power. And if you listen to their rhetoric, it's pretty funny. It's absurd. They refer to Lula as a communist dictator, which he's neither of those things. I mean, he is a left social democrat who has an independent foreign policy and wants Brazil to have an important role in the kind of new non-aligned movement in a multipolar world. So he's not like there's a big difference between being a social democrat in the imperial core and in the periphery. But he's not a communist. I mean, communists know that, but fascists refer to him as a communist. And he's obviously not a dictator. I mean, he just won the election despite the fact that Bolsonaro actually used billions of dollars worth of state funding in order to fund his campaign and basically bribe people to try to vote for him in the lead up to the election on October 30th, 2022. So Bolsonaro fled the country 2 days before his term ended, and Lula was inaugurated on January 1st. And this is also a really interesting coup attempt because I've never seen a coup attempt where the people who are trying to install a certain leader don't mention the fact that that leader is not even in their country. He's living in Florida right now, and there's no indication that Bolsonaro plans on returning to Brazil. I mean, he went to Orlando, Florida. He's been living in the house of an MMA fighter, and
Yes.
There are reports that he's probably going to end up in one of Trump's resorts, like Mar-a-Lago or something. So, I mean, he's in the country where he actually serves, which is the United States. The U.S. played a key role in installing Bolsonaro into power in the first place. He only came to power because in 2016, there was a political coup against the elected president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, who was Lula's successor from the Workers' Party. And then in 2018, Lula was imprisoned on fake charges. And the judge who oversaw both the impeachment against Dilma and the imprisonment of Lula on fake charges, his name is Sergio Moro, and he is someone who throughout his career had been cultivated by the United States. And then after he imprisoned Lula, which handed the victory to Bolsonaro in the 2018 election. Then Bolsonaro promoted this judge, Sergio Moro, to be his justice minister. And he was so powerful that people referred to him as the super justice minister. And then immediately after, he and Bolsonaro visited the United States and they went to CIA headquarters, just clearly acknowledging the fact that the CIA was supporting them, was behind these coups. And Sergio Moro eventually turned against Bolsonaro. But the point is, just as the U.S. also eventually turned against Bolsonaro after he outlived his usefulness. There are many cases of that throughout history. But the point is that Bolsonaro only came to power because of these U.S.-backed coups. And the Supreme Court in Brazil later dropped all of the charges against Lula, said that they violated his civil rights. They were false charges. And the United Nations Human Rights Committee also said that Lula's civil and political rights were violated, and he was not guaranteed due process in the case in which he was imprisoned. So Bolsonaro, the whole far-right Brazilian movement, you can link it to the dictatorship of Brazil, which governed until 1985, an actual military far-right dictatorship that was installed through a coup backed by the CIA in the 1960s. And Bolsonaro has his origins as working in the military dictatorship, being in the military. And after the military ended in 85, Bolsonaro was always this far-right fringe politician who defended the military dictatorship and wanted to try to restore the military dictatorship. So in his actual government, he had the most ministers who were military officers since the military dictatorship. That is to say that all of the civilian governments after, every once in a while they might have had a general or something in their cabinet, but he had more military officers than anyone else before him. So Bolsonaro, his goal, if he could have pulled it off, he would have tried to have a military coup, but he was unable to. He didn't have the political support inside the military for a variety of reasons. But I mean, Bolsonaro's popularity toward the end of his campaign, of his mandate, the most recent poll I saw toward the end of 2022 was around 30% support. He never had majority support, really. I mean, this also gets back to this historical argument. People say that, well, Hitler was elected. Well, not really, actually. Fascism never really has majority support. They work within bourgeois democracy, and they know how to play the game. They know how to find these different weaknesses. And in the case of Bolsonaro, he was installed because of U.S.-backed coups. He never could have won a free and fair election. And that's why Lula is the first president who, since bourgeois democracy was restored in 1985, he's the first president who defeated an incumbent. And in the 2018 election, Lula was leading in all of the polling against Bolsonaro by double digits. So the only reason that they could get Bolsonaro into power is through these coups. And then when Bolsonaro was in power, his support base was largely the agricultural sector of Brazil, which is very powerful because Brazil is a very large country. It has a lot of very good, agricultural land. And its top exports include agriculture, especially things like soybeans. And he oversaw a policy of just mass destruction of the Amazon rainforest, which also included ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples. And there are now a series of court cases against Bolsonaro and his past government officials in Brazil, accusing them of genocide and ethnic cleansing and crimes against the indigenous nations in Brazil, because Bolsonaro basically just let these big agricultural corporations do whatever they want, and they funded his campaign. So, he always represented the Brazilian financial bourgeoisie, the agricultural capitalists, and certain elements of, the petty bourgeoisie, certain elements of religious sectors, part of the evangelical church, although part of the evangelicals also went for Lula. And if you look at the vote in the October 30th election, working class and poor Brazilians voted for Lula by over 2-1 compared to Bolsonaro. So there's no question that, despite the fact that Lula is not Fidel Castro, he did definitely have the working class behind him solidly, the labor unions in Brazil, the social movements, And that's why he came to power. And that's why this was a last-ditch effort to prevent him from governing.
How do you analyze the contradictions, so to speak, when it comes to Lula seemingly being accepted by the West after this election? Clearly, in this coup attempt, Biden, Trudeau, they put out comments in defense of Lula, but Lula clearly putting out a foreign policy and domestic policy that is definitely counterintuitive to what U.S. and Western policy is. When we talk about a Latin American currency, that's a massive shift. I remember watching a video, I think from you a few days ago, about this as well, talking about China moving away from the petrodollar and establishing a gold reserve and stuff like that. That the dollar hegemony being in such crisis. What do you make of the U.S.'s perception of Lula right now? Is Bolsonaro sort of the sacrificial lamb for the Democratic Party in a sense, since they can't really prosecute Trump in the way that they want to, that Bolsonaro is a Trump-like figure that they're going to throw him to the wolves in a sense because he's outlived his usefulness? Or is this, 4D chess from U.S. State Department and, we're going to see more coup attempts, maybe even U.S. supported coup attempts in the near future against Lula because of his foreign policy?
Yeah, good question. There are a lot of factors for this. I mean, I wouldn't say that the West supports Lula, but they did allow him to come to power largely because Bolsonaro outlived his usefulness and because he wasn't really reliable for a variety of reasons. First of all, Bolsonaro did severe damage to the Brazilian economy, including to parts of, the interests of the capitalist class were hurt by Bolsonaro. Brazil has been in a protracted economic crisis for years now, especially in the 2010s. The U.S. helped oversee, the Obama administration helped oversee this really insane suicidal economic policy of trying to crash oil prices. And I've done a lot of reporting on that. And that was to hurt Russia after the 2014 coup in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. With the sanctions, they were trying to hurt, the U.S. was trying to hurt Russia, but it was also trying to hurt Venezuela and Iran. But other countries that rely on commodity exports, like Brazil also has oil and is an oil exporter, and Mexico. I mean, other countries were kind of collateral damage of that attempt to crash commodities. And there was this big commodities boom in the 2000s, but by the 2010s, it crashed. And that hurt a lot of those economies in Latin America. And it partially explains why there was a short-term shift to the right in some of these countries. And in the case of Brazil, the Brazilian economy has never really recovered since like 2014, 15. It's just been in a perpetual economic crisis since then. And when Bolsonaro came in, his strategy was just straight up neoliberal shock therapy, Chicago boy style. And Bolsonaro's finance minister, named Paulo Guedes, was a literal Chicago boy. He actually studied the University of Chicago, but he was one of the stupidest Chicago boys. In fact, he studied under Milton Friedman, but people said he had the worst dissertation. So after that, he went to Chile and he's taught economics in Chile under Pinochet. This is the definition of a Chicago boy. And his supposed solution for the economic crisis in Brazil was mass privatization of state institutions. And it didn't work, obviously. I mean, sometimes if you just look at GDP, which is a really dumb measurement of the economy because all it does is measure the size of the economy. But if banks charge more interest on loans, that increases GDP. If people have to pay more interest and more rent, that increases GDP. That's not actual productive economic growth of the economy. So it's a really bad measure, but that's what neoclassical economists use frequently. And even according to those bourgeois metrics, Bolsonaro did not significantly grow the economy. It was a disaster. And yeah, he sold off all of these state assets, which you would think that it gives the government in the short term all this extra cash that they can use to stimulate the economy. And no, it just went into corruption. So even according to their own bourgeois metrics, Bolsonaro was a complete disaster. And according to their bourgeois metrics, Lula oversaw massive historic growth in Brazil. And this is the point that he's always made, is that growth benefits poor and working people, but it also benefits the Brazilian capitalist class. And he's not a socialist, but he does have this idea of what used to be referred to as import substitution industrialization, which is a method by which third world countries in the 60s and 70s were trying to develop their economies before the rise of neoliberalism. I mean, of course, you did have socialist and communist governments, but many countries in the global south at that peak of the national liberation struggle era in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were implementing this kind of strategy of import substitution industrialization, where they were developing their own local industry, creating technology, creating planes. Many countries had their own airlines. All of that was destroyed by neoliberalism. Everything was privatized. It was sold off to international capital. And Brazil is a large country. It is the 6th most populous country on earth. It used to be the 6th largest economy on earth, although it shrunk under Bolsonaro. And also it shrunk under Michel Temer, the unelected coup leader who came into power after the 2016 political coup against Dilma Rousseff. And he was in power from 2016 until 2018 when Bolsonaro came in. So the other thing is that Bolsonaro's foreign policy did shift a bit. When he first came in, he was joined at the hip with Donald Trump, and he had been a key player, of course, in the coup attempt against Venezuela, because the U.S. was trying to organize this coup to overthrow Venezuela, and they needed Brazil on their side. Brazil is the biggest country in Latin America. It has the biggest economy in Latin America. If you're going to try to unify the region against Venezuela, you have to have Brazil on your side. And in 2019, when the U.S. launched this coup attempt with Juan Guaido, one of many coup attempts, but the latest, Bolsonaro was a key force, not only in politically supporting it, but Brazil has a large border with Venezuela, and Brazil launched cross-border terror attacks inside Venezuelan territory, which were admitted by the major Brazilian newspaper, O Globo, which is completely mainstream. They admitted that Bolsonaro backed these terror attacks inside Venezuelan territory. And he was part of an attempt to try to create a physical blockade of Venezuela, not only an economic blockade, along with the far-right government of Iván Duque in Colombia. And now in Colombia, the first ever left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, has taken power. So that means that Venezuela's neighbors, Colombia and Brazil, had far-right governments that refused to recognize the Venezuelan government. And now they have left-wing governments that recognize Maduro. So Brazil was a key player in there. And then finally, in terms of other foreign policy elements, I mean, when Biden came in, Bolsonaro refused to recognize his victory and said that the victory was stolen and that Donald Trump was, the real president, along with a large part of the Republican Party. And usually throughout most of U.S. history, when it comes to foreign policy, Democrats and Republicans are basically the same. But this was an example, actually, where there was a difference, where because Bolsonaro refused to recognize Biden's victory, I mean, that did actually create a lot of political cleavage between the U.S. and Brazil, interestingly. And it shows that some of these far-right figures in not just Latin America and other parts of the world, they actually sometimes, although they don't have a working class base, and they usually come to power with the support of the bourgeoisie, sometimes they end up hurting the interests in the long term of the bourgeoisie, and then the bourgeoisie turns against them and tries to find someone else to replace them. And that's clearly the case of what happened in Bolsonaro. And in his last year, because Biden was basically giving him a diplomatic cold shoulder, he ended up ironically turning to Russia. He couldn't turn to China because Bolsonaro campaigned on demonizing China. He's deeply anti-communist, a virulent he's a fascist. Bolsonaro openly defended the Pinochet dictatorship. He's a straight-up fascist. He said the problem with Pinochet is that Pinochet didn't kill enough people. And he spent his entire campaign claiming that Lula's a communist and the PT are all communists and they're working with China, which, I mean, they were working with China. They're not communists, but they were close to China. And then when COVID broke out, he referred to COVID as the China virus, and he said it was created in a Chinese lab and all that. And so what he ended up ironically doing is turning to Russia, partially because Russia is the world's largest exporter of advanced chemical fertilizer, and because Brazil relies very heavily on importing fertilizer. It's one of the world's largest importers of fertilizer. So he really grew much closer to Russia, which also increasingly angered the United States. So it's not to say that like Bolsonaro was like an anti-imperialist, not at all. He was simply acting in his own short-term interests. He had no commitment to anything other than, just backward, reactionary, neo-feudal, patriarchal politics. Like that's the political program he represents. But because he had those contradictions with the United States, it led to the U.S. basically allowing Lula to come to power. But I mean, as soon as Lula actually can start governing in the next few years, he's already pledged that he's going to strengthen the BRICS bloc. He's already called for creating this pan-Latin American currency. He's going to have good relations with the U.S. Of course, it's inevitable, but he's going to increase his relations with other countries. He's committed to the process of South-South integration. So the U.S. is going to spend the next few years trying to find a suitable replacement. And the reality is that sometimes imperialists recognize that maybe like a more technocratic right-wing neoliberal is better than like one of these crazy fascists who are just very unreliable. And we've seen that throughout history. The U.S. will support these fascist characters, but then when they actually take power, they're very unreliable, and imperialism will try to replace them with a much more reliable technocrat.
Now, obviously we've seen what's sort of been deemed like a pink tide 2.0 in recent years. You mentioned Colombia, even Honduras to a degree. Obviously Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua are still there. Chile is whatever. I feel like Boric is one of those that doesn't fit the category of that new, pink tide. And now we've seen sort of in lockstep with it and also in reaction to it, a lot of coup attempts, a lot of disruption attempts. We had Operation Gideon in Venezuela. We had the Haitian president being assassinated by, I believe it was it Colombian mercenaries.
Yeah, but they were also FBI and DEA informants.
Yes.
The U.S. has its fingerprints all over the assassination of Jovenel Moise, and it was allegedly because he was considering restoring relations with Venezuela in order to get money back from the Petrocaribe, oil back from the Petrocaribe program, and also because right before he was assassinated, he had taken a trip to Turkey, now known as Turquía, where he met with a bunch of leaders from Asia that are part of like this kind of new non-aligned movement, and was allegedly considering like working with like Russia and all this stuff. And there's a lot of shady things that happen in Haiti there. But yeah.
And then we had the SOS Cuba, color revolution attempt. We can have slight attempts in Nicaragua as well. We had was it Kirchner in Argentina get sort of deposed via lawfare recently as well, and obviously what happened with Pedro Castillo in Peru. What's your assessment on, because I do want to talk about Peru specifically, but what's your assessment overall on the strength of this new wave of leftist working class movements taking power, and then the strength also on the other side of the fascistic bourgeois power within Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, Latin America is really the vanguard, I think, for the left, for the entire world, really, in many ways. Going back to the Cuban Revolution, I mean, of course, you have the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, but after them, I mean, you certainly have the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnamese, the Korean revolutions, but most of and you have national liberation struggles across Africa, Algeria, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, South Africa. I mean, so many. Burkina Faso. I mean, there's so many. But in terms of countries that have been able to hold on to power, right? Like obviously most of those governments were overthrown. Today you have China, DPRK, Vietnam, and Laos, and Latin America. So, I mean, there are a few countries in Asia, I mean, including the largest country on earth, China, but that were able to hold on to their revolutions. But in terms of Latin America, it's the only other place in the world really where they've been able to hold on. And I guess, also Zimbabwe. But I mean, it's been very difficult.
Its proximity to the imperial core, I think, is what makes it so almost astonishing that, like, the fact that Cuba, 60 miles away from Florida, is able to still hold on. Daniel Ortega, gaining power back, and the Sandinistas gaining power back after they gave it away, like, willingly, in a sense. Like, it's like you said, the staying power of Latin America is something to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba, it's absolutely incredible. This is one of the oldest socialist revolutions, and they never lost power. And there is something incredible that should be studied about that, despite the fact that they're, a 2-hour plane flight from Florida. And the fact that the U.S. just between, the victory of the revolution on January 1st, 1959, and right up until 2013, when there was this documentary published, we know that the CIA tried to assassinate Fidel Castro 638 times, not to mention the blockade that has resulted in just countless suffering and continues after 60 years. And this country has held on. I mean, it really is amazing. But yeah, clearly in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas came to power in 79, and then they lost power because of a U.S.-backed terror war and a blockade. In the 1980s, they lost power in 1990, but they came back in 2007 and have been able to solidify the revolution again. And Bolivia has also become another important part of this revolutionary process, along with Venezuela, of course. And those 4 countries are part of the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, which is an economic bloc that seeks the economic integration of Latin America and the Caribbean, not only political. And now, I mean, for the first time in history in Latin America, the 6th most populous countries in Latin America have left-wing governments. So that includes Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. I mean, left-leaning-ish, but anyway. Also, Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela. All of them have left-wing governments. And well, Peru had a left-wing leader, Pedro Castillo, and we're going to talk about that with the coup. But that's historic. And the shift in Colombia really needs to be emphasized. Gustavo Petro honestly has exceeded my expectations.
Yes.
And he himself, he was a revolutionary guerrilla. He was part of an armed movement called M19, the 19th of April movement, which was not technically Marxist-Leninist. It was Bolivarian socialist, kind of similar to Hugo Chavez. And they were engaged in an armed struggle until they signed a peace deal with the Colombian government in the 1990s, and they put down their arms. And then their leader was almost immediately assassinated after signing the peace agreement. And Gustavo Petro, he was as a young militant, he was part of that movement, and then he later became a politician. And when he campaigned for president, he did make a lot of comments, criticizing Venezuela and Nicaragua and such. But actually, now that he's been in office, he has maintained a very independent foreign policy. He just took his 2nd trip to Venezuela in a few months. He immediately recognized Venezuela's government. He immediately reopened the border. And he has, even more interestingly, he's been talking about how Colombia and Venezuela are one Bolivarian nation, how the borders were drawn by colonialists, and how, the Patria Grande, the great dream of regional integration of Latin America, needs to be pursued. And, there's this term of the pink tide, which is never used in Latin America. A much better term is the project of Latin American regional integration. And of course, the right-wing forces in Latin America overwhelmingly are comprador bourgeois forces that are not loyal to their countries. They're loyal to U.S. imperialism. They do not believe in the regional integration of Latin America. And it's the left that is engaged in this process of regional integration through institutions that were created, like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. And they're having their summit at the end of January in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And also, I mentioned the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA, also UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. And now that Lula is back, he has pledged to reinvigorate, to revive these institutions of regional integration. So, I mean, that is the real project to end neocolonialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. As Kwame Nkrumah, the great Ghanaian revolutionary leader and socialist who was overthrown in a US-backed coup, as he famously wrote in his book Neocolonialism, political independence of the colonies was not enough. They needed to have economic independence. And we've seen, especially in the neoliberal era, the use of debt and so many other instruments to impose this neocolonial control on these countries. The only way that they can truly be independent, as Nkrumah said, is through regional unity. Nkrumah was a Pan-Africanist, and in Latin America, the solution for that is regional integration of the region. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And now with Lula in Brazil, I think it's going to really continue accelerating.
Now, last question on Brazil and Lula. One of the major criticisms of his previous tenure was his occupation of Haiti against Aristide. And overall, I mean, we're in a situation now where Haiti is close to being occupied by U.S. forces again and UN forces again. It's been in perpetual turmoil and class struggle for since as long as I've been reporting on politics and news. What is the likelihood of Lula sort of repeating that mistake?
It's not going to happen. I mean, the Workers' Party has made it clear that was a major mistake, and there were a few reasons for that. I mean, first of all, of course, it is a criticism that can be mentioned. That's a fair criticism, but we should keep in mind that Brazil was not the main player. It was the United States and France and Canada. And it's sometimes weird. I see people, this kind of ultra-left critique of Lula, where they forget the actual imperialist powers that, unfortunately, yes, Brazil did join with in the United Nations. But it's not like Lula was like, hey, United States, join me in occupying Haiti. No, it was like, hey, the United States always, this is how imperialism functions, it always tries to provide a veneer of multilateralism to its actions, right? So when Western imperialists wanted to destroy Libya, they tried to use the veneer of getting a UN Security Council treaty. And unfortunately, at that moment in 2011, they did get it passed because at that moment, China and Russia, they abstained in the vote. So it's all about this marketing of having the legitimacy of a multilateral institution. So in the case of what Lula was thinking, I mean, one, his first thought was at that moment, he was in an intense lobbying campaign to try to get Brazil to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And again, this isn't to justify what he did, but you have to understand that the UN Security Council was created by the victors in World War II, which, I mean, yeah, they defeated fascism. That's good, right? But that's not a representative, democratic institution if you're going to actually run global affairs at the United Nations. So that means that France and Britain, which are relatively small countries, they have permanent seats in the UN Security Council, but not Indonesia, one of the world's largest countries, not India, which has, after China, is the second most populous country, and soon it's going to be the most populous country, not Brazil, the sixth most populous country, not Pakistan. So these are massive countries. Nigeria, they need to have permanent seats in the Security Council if we actually want this body to be representative. But of course, the United States and the other European colonial powers, France and Britain, don't want to reform the UN Security Council because they have veto power. So anyway, the point is that at that moment, Lula thought naively that if he went along with this, because it was technically a UN occupation, and it was technically multilateral in scare quotes, and Brazil was part of it, along with the US and Canada and France. Obviously, that was a big mistake because they said, okay, yeah, go along with it, and we'll consider, reforming the UN Security Council, and they never did it. So it's a criticism that should be considered, and it's also a criticism that can definitely be levied right now. Mexico has no excuse for this because Mexico saw what happened. Brazil learned from it. But unfortunately, Mexico right now, Andrés Manuel López Obrador he's the first left-wing president in Mexico in 50 years. And on a lot of policies, especially domestic policies, he's been quite good. He's tripled the minimum wage. He's renationalized the oil. He nationalized the lithium. He's expanded education. He's done a lot of great things. But in terms of foreign policy, López Obrador is much more focused on domestic policy. In fact, he often says the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy. and he's kind of just like let his foreign minister Marcelo Ebrard oversee his foreign policy. And Marcelo Ebrard is just like a bourgeois diplomat. His background is not in the social movements, unlike López Obrador. And Marcelo Ebrard is also just frequently going along with whatever the U.S. wants. So that's definitely a much more valid criticism against Mexico right now, which is going along with the U.S. and trying to redo this horrible occupation of Haiti that last time resulted in so many deaths.
Now on to Peru, which was one of those, recent new left-wing governments. After a very recent dictatorship, the Fujimori dictatorship ended when 2000 or something like that. It was very recently.
2000.
And obviously we knew that his tenure was going to be far more difficult. He had far more institutional roadblocks than, let's say, Lula is going to have right now, or even Petro in Colombia. I mean, what's your assessment right now of the uprising, so to speak, of the people? Because last time I checked, we were on either the fourth day of a national strike or it was the fifth day of the national strike. I just saw a video last night of I forget what city it was, but the people that were mobilized and were chanting basically for civil war was what the translation was. We're in a very intense situation now in Peru. What's your assessment of it? And as we just saw, I think 17 people were killed in a single day as well. The repression is definitely getting higher there. Your analysis of it?
It's a very dangerous moment. I'm glad you mentioned that there was a straight up fascist dictator, Alberto Fujimori, who committed genocide against indigenous people, who governed from 1990 until 2000. And he's currently in prison. And his daughter, Keiko Fujimori, she was the other main presidential candidate in the 2021 election, running against Pedro Castillo. And she came close to winning. And everyone knows that if she comes to power, she's going to release her father. She herself is also under investigation for extreme corruption, like all of these right-wing forces in Latin America, because they're all funded by the oligarchy, by the capitalist class. And in the case of Peru, Pedro Castillo never had a majority in the Congress. And the Congress is really a reflection of the legacy of the Fujimori dictatorship. Fujimori, he dissolved Congress unconstitutionally, unlike Pedro Castillo. He tried to do it, which was constitutionally. I'll come back to that in a second. But Fujimori then, after dissolving Congress and being a dictator, he created a new constitution, which was a complete neoliberal constitution, basically written by Washington, and it incorporated all of the elements of the Washington Consensus. Keep in mind, this is the peak of neoliberalism in 1993, right? This is right after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the counter-revolution, the imposition of neoliberal shock therapy in the Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin. I mean, a brutal moment. And Fujimori basically made it impossible for future governments to do anything other than that neoliberal program because it's baked into the Constitution. So when Pedro Castillo governed, when he campaigned to run for president, his main promise was that he wanted to have a constitutional referendum, a constituent assembly to create a new constitution. And the reason he was well known is because he led a teacher's strike. He is a teacher and a farmer from a poor rural area of indigenous descent, like the majority of Peruvians. And the majority of Peruvians of indigenous descent have not had representation in the bourgeois democratic system. This is a country that still is really, in many ways, this kind of colonial construct where the government is run by people of European descent, or in the case of the Fujimori family, Japanese descent, Fujimori was a dual Japanese citizen, but like the majority indigenous descent Peruvians had not had representation until Pedro Castillo. And as soon as he came in, the Congress immediately tried to launch numerous coup attempts against him. And then the judicial system, which is controlled by, the corrupt right-wing oligarchy and not elected, they immediately launched what you could call lawfare, legal warfare against him and his ministers, accusing them of terrorism and fake corruption charges and all of this, and just waging hybrid war against his government, destabilizing him. he basically wasn't able to do very much, which is why, I mean, to be honest, his approval ratings were not very high, but that's just because, he was a lame duck president from day one. And then he tried to, ironically, one of the most popular decisions he tried to carry out, which was dissolving Congress, which is allowed according to Article 113 of the Constitution. And he tried to dissolve Congress in order to have a constituent assembly to write a new constitution and then new elections. And then he was doing that in response to a third congressional coup attempt against him. And right one day before the congressional coup against him, the U.S. ambassador to Peru, who is a CIA veteran, her name is Lisa Kenna. She worked for the CIA for at least 9 years. And you know what they say about the CIA? There's no such thing as a former CIA agent. So she met with the defense minister of Peru one day before the coup. And then when he tried to dissolve Congress to have a new constitutional referendum, then the defense minister called for the military to rise up against him and called Castillo a dictator. So they arrested him. And then the Congress appointed his vice president as president, despite the fact that she has no popular support. And she actually technically had been part of the same left-wing party that Pedro Castillo had been part of, which is called Peru Libre. But she was actually expelled from that party in January of 2022. And she said that she never believed in their ideology. So she was expelled from the party nearly a year before the coup. And then she clearly made an alliance with the right wing. In a speech on the congressional floor on the day of the coup, she called for a government of national unity with the right-wing opposition that lost the election. And since then, her cabinet has been full of all these right-wingers. And that led to these massive protests. And the protests are very clear. They have three main demands. One, they want new elections as soon as possible, which the right-wing oligarch-controlled Congress refuses to hold. They keep delaying the elections. Two, they want Pedro Castillo to be released from prison. He's been in prison for 18 months without trial. And three, they want a constituent assembly to create a new constitution. And of course, the oligarch-controlled Peruvian state refuses to do that. Peru is not in any way, it's not even a bourgeois democracy. It is, an oligarchy. And it's controlled by the capitalist class and the capitalist interests in Peru. I did a story over at geopoliticaleconomy.com with a journalist in Peru looking at the past 7 presidents in 6 years. And of those past 7 presidents, half of them worked at the World Bank. Many of them worked at New York-based investment banks. One of them, this infamous multimillionaire oligarch in Peru named Pedro Pablo Kuczynski of Polish descent. He was a U.S. citizen until 2015. He spent half of his life living in the United States. He was born in Peru, and then he was educated in the U.S. and spent half his life living and working in the United States, working at a New York investment bank, working at the World Bank. And then he moved back to Peru to get involved in politics. And in 2015, he gave up his U.S. citizenship to run for president of Peru. This is what we're talking about. This is a country that doesn't have its sovereignty. So, what we're seeing is part of a process, really, of a new kind of national liberation against U.S. neocolonialism. And now we see these massive protests, and the coup regime has responded with extreme violence. 47 protesters, according to official government data, have been killed since the coup in 1 month ago. And on January 9th, in the city of Puno, which is an indigenous majority area, 17 protesters were killed in one day. It was a massacre. And now what we're seeing is an increasing call for potential armed uprising, a militarization to fight against this coup regime that clearly, it's not a democracy, even a bourgeois democracy. There is no way for the indigenous descent majority and working class majority to have representation. And that's a very sad thing, obviously. We don't want even more violence here, but this is a rational response to a coup regime that has refused to allow any democratic, even bourgeois democratic institutions, and By the way, the coup regime now has brought back a bunch of veterans from the Fujimori dictatorship. The man overseeing Peruvian intelligence right now, including the feared intelligence police, he was a veteran of the Fujimori dictatorship when Fujimori was carrying out forced sterilization of over 300,000 indigenous peoples, which is textbook genocide, and disappearing and killing and torturing thousands of leftists. They brought back some of those same people. And right now, there's this kind of political musical chairs. Clearly, Dina Boluarte, who's the figurehead in power, I don't think she's going to last very long. The question is who's going to replace her. And there are a lot of signs indicating that the far-right Fujimorista elements want to replace her with Jose Williams, another indigenous last name, right? Williams. They want to replace her with Jose Williams. Who is he? He was the former commander of the military. He oversaw under Fujimori the cover-up of a massacre of indigenous people. He's also closely linked to drug cartels, and he's the president of the Congress. So if they can remove her, they can probably replace her with Jose Williams, and he's probably just going to try to do a full-on Fujimori-style dictatorship. And meanwhile, the Congress keeps voting to delay the elections.
Now, when we saw Evo Morales be deposed in Bolivia, we saw, massive struggle there, and we saw trade unions organize along with indigenous groups. I remember seeing, videos of caravans of people coming down from the mountains into the cities to partake in a real struggle and to get MAS back into power as a political entity. Does Peru have anything close to that can really challenge the fascist dictatorship in any way?
Yes and no. No, in the sense that Peru does not have the same level of organized labor militancy. And they have the militancy, but it's not organized in the same way. I spent quite a bit of time in Bolivia, and it is incredible to see how organized the labor movement is there. And that's because they were always unionized, but they were always organized. But when Evo came to power, he intentionally governed in a way where the labor unions and the labor federations governed alongside the government, alongside the state. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the Bolivian model, it's incredible. The official name for the MAS party, which stands for Movement Towards Socialism, the full name is MAS-IPSP, which stands for Movement Towards Socialism the political instrument for the sovereignty of the peoples. When they say that, when you hear speeches, Evo often refers to the party as the political instrument. So what they're saying is that the social movements and the labor unions are the actual instruments of popular power, and their political instrument is the party and the state. So when they were overthrown in 2019 in this US-backed far-right coup, they still controlled huge parts of society because the majority of people in Bolivia are indigenous, and the majority of working class people are indigenous, and they largely support the MAS party. There are non-indigenous Bolivians, of course, who also support MAS, and they are linked into the unions, especially agricultural workers in places like Cochabamba, which is the main hub of support. They went on strikes multiple times, and they paralyzed the country and prevented the coup regime from being able to govern. The coup regime in Bolivia tried to delay elections 3 times. And in response, every time the MAS and the social movements and the labor federations, we're not just talking about unions, we're talking about massive organized labor federations that control a huge percentage of the industries and workforce in Bolivia. They shut down the economy, and they made it impossible for the coup regime to govern, which is why the coup regime was forced to finally hold elections in October of 2020. And I was there. I was observing the elections as a journalist. It was an incredible process, and that was a victory. In Peru, it's a very different situation. They have the militancy. They do have some unions, and they have a working class that is very vibrant and is willing to fight and struggle and rise up and protest. But it's not nearly as organized, and they don't really have political power for a variety of reasons. One, because They didn't have a government that governed on their behalf for over a decade, like in the case of Evo, right? With a strong political party. I mean, the political parties in Peru are so weak that Pedro Castillo, he was chosen by Peru Libre. Peru Libre is actually technically a Marxist-Leninist party, but he was not a cadre of that party. He was a popular social figure because he led this teacher's strike. And then Peru Libre recognized that he could be a good presidential candidate. So they recruited him. But then after he entered office, he had a fight with the party. And there's also some legitimate criticism of Peru Libre. I've heard from people in Peru, comrades who have good politics, and they said that they kind of had some ultra-left criticisms. And anyway, the point is that he had a falling out with his own party. And I mean, there's so much political fracturing inside Peru. And the other parties that exist, like for instance, which is called Nuevo Peru, which is the party of Veronica Mendoza, who is the other left-wing candidate, who's like a feminist, socialist, ecologist. She's pretty good as well, and she formed a coalition with Pedro Castillo. Her party is also very new, and there are some other parties, but they're very small parties. I mean, so the problem with the Peruvian left is similar to the problem of the left in many global north countries. It's very small and fractured. And in the case of Peru, part of that also is because of the brutal violence of the Fujimori dictatorship, and also because of the extreme ultra-leftism and violence of Sendero Luminoso, known as Shining Path, which was this ultra-sectarian Maoist group that engaged in very violent armed struggle. And they actually started before the Fujimori dictatorship. Originally, they actually started against a left-wing military dictatorship. Peru, it's a very complicated story. Peru is the only country in Latin America that had a left-wing military dictatorship that was allied with the Soviet Union and Cuba. And ironically, because of the Sino-Soviet split, Shining Path emerged originally opposing the left-wing military dictatorship and basically being on the same side as Pinochet, which was the neighbor, against the left-wing military dictatorship in Peru. And then after the left-wing military dictatorship was overthrown and replaced by right-wing regimes, then Shining Path entered the opposition again, and then they engaged in this brutal armed struggle in which they spent a lot of their time killing the other parts of the left, by the way. And then when Fujimori came to power, one of the reasons he originally came to power in 1990, he was elected, it was because he was campaigning against the violence of Sendero Luminoso. But Shining Path, to be a little fair, I mean, I disagree with many of their politics and their tactics. They did have some support in rural areas because there were rural areas in Peru that were completely abandoned by the state. They had no, education and healthcare. They had no running water and electricity. And some of them did join the Shining Path insurgency. So it led to this case of extreme violence in the country that's not dissimilar to parts of rural Colombia, right, with the guerrilla groups. And then what happened is Fujimori, when he dissolved the bourgeois democratic institutions and created a fascist dictatorship, he crushed anyone on the left, despite the fact that the Shining Path was killing a lot of people on the left, and they considered Cuba and DPRK and China and every existing socialist government to be social fascist and social imperialist, and they said that they were the only true communist force in the world. Meanwhile, anyone who opposed the Fujimori dictatorship was considered a terrorist. And this is a process we see today. I mentioned that the judicial system charged the sitting president, Pedro Castillo, and his ministers with terrorism. That's a legacy of the 1990s, when Fujimori's dictatorship would accuse anyone on the left, labor organizers, progressive social movement activists, of being a terrorist and of being sympathizers with Shining Path. So the Peruvian left has never been able to recover from that brutal era. And I mean, obviously Fujimori bears the responsibility for that, just destruction of the left, but also, I mean, ultra-leftism and Shining Path does bear some responsibility as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree there. I know we don't have much more time with you, Ben. I want to quickly get your thoughts on China's new COVID policies as it's moved away from zero COVID. If you're just watching Western media, it was portrayed as there's massive protests all over China about COVID. They're not reporting it right, and China therefore changed its COVID policies as a result of it. And you read a little bit, of Falun Gong. You get the with the military coup that allegedly happened, even though that same general that committed the coup is now, I think, the full commander of the ground forces in China. So, I mean, what's your take on China's move from zero COVID and its, lack of a better term, class struggle? It's class dynamics right now, as there are, from a seemingly outsider perspective, some unrest to some degree. For what end, to what it's directed at, it's very hard to tell. As a communist in the U.S., when you see videos of protests in China, what are the real reasons? Because it's always portrayed as one way.
Yeah, I mean, I know quite a few people in China that I talk to all the time to try to figure out what's going on. I mean, I'll be honest, they're mostly in like the big cities, so my sources tend to be a little more biased toward like the large urban areas. I don't know what's going on as much in the rural areas, but from what I've heard from talking to some friends and sources there, I mean, the protests that there were very small, and a lot of them didn't even know about the protests. Obviously, they were all over the Western media, but there's not a lot of coverage in Chinese media. There was some in social media, right? But they didn't even know because they were so small. But interestingly, despite the fact that they were so small, the Chinese government did respond to them. And it reflects the fact that, I mean, zero COVID did save countless lives, especially at the peak when when the most deadly strains of COVID were out. And I mean, in the United States, over 1 million people died. And that's probably a conservative estimate, honestly. And in Brazil, by the way, speaking of Bolsonaro, more than 700,000 people died, which makes both the US and Brazil countries with some of the largest deaths per capita in the world. And China, until recently, had almost zero deaths, which is incredible. But I mean, zero COVID could have been a long-term policy if the world had implemented it. I mean, it could have been a policy, like if the world had, when COVID broke out, if the world had taken it seriously, then they could have defeated COVID at the beginning, right? But when you have a federalized system like the US, where you just have states just completely just do whatever they want, in the case of Florida, and just have no public health policies, and that's why in Florida, you just had skyrocketing deaths, especially among elderly people, people with chronic health issues, people with diabetes. I mean, just horrible death rates. I mean, if you're in a global community and you have a virus that doesn't obey borders, right? Like, how can you deal with that forever? I mean, China made the decision that in the long term, it was no longer feasible to continue having zero COVID. And the moment where they did it was the moment where clearly there were people who were getting tired of some of these policies. And so now the difference, though, is that, so I wanted to make that point because it's funny, because the US constantly shows these protests and then says China is authoritarian, but China actually is very responsive to these protests, despite the fact that they're quite small. Also, Iran, by the way, there were these protests in Iran, and Iran responded by abolishing the patrol forces that the people were asking to be abolished. Unlike in the US, there were huge protests in 2020 against systemic racism and police brutality. And what was the response of the US government? In most major cities in the United States, funding for police increased, not decreased. So which society is more democratic? Anyway, and in the case of China's COVID policies now, I mean, what's so funny is seeing the same people who were attacking China for years for having zero COVID and saying it's authoritarian. Now they're attacking China and saying that it's not protecting its people enough from COVID. I mean, it really just shows that the propaganda is never ideologically coherent. It's always just about demonizing China. But if you look at what China's policy is now, I mean, yes, it is essentially a policy of recognizing that COVID is going to be endemic, because that was what many other parts of the world ended up doing. And if you're a huge country like China in this world where a virus doesn't recognize borders, you're going to have to recognize that it's going to be endemic as well, but with maximum protection and public health measures. And what's so funny is I've even seen people say that like, oh, China like has low vaccination rates. China has higher vaccination rates than the United States. So China is now going through a process where, after having waded through the most dangerous strands of COVID that were much more deadly, it is now recognizing that COVID is going to become endemic, but with strong public health measures, with very high rates of vaccination, over 90%, and making sure that it minimizes human suffering, which is like, I mean, I don't know what other policy it would have had, unfortunately, because again, one country cannot, with a virus that ignores borders, one country cannot maintain a policy that the rest of the world has abandoned. I think what it's doing is very similar to what Vietnam did. And Vietnam had also a very positive outcome. If you look at Vietnam's death rates compared to the US, I mean, it's just a small fraction. Or, by the way, to be honest, I mean, even countries that don't have socialist governments but have much more state control, like Singapore or South Korea. I mean, these are countries where, for instance, the economist Ha Jun Chang has done really. He's a South Korean economist. Has done a lot of. He's like a new Keynesian kind of developmental social democrat economist, but he's very critical of neoliberalism. And even if you look at his work, he points out that even a lot of like the so-called East Asian, like the tigers or whatever, like the
tiger economy.
that had. Sorry.
The tiger economies, right?
Exactly. Their economies are not the same like neoliberal, deeply financialized economies as the US. And they have much more state control over the economy, and also state control over public health and other parts of society. And if you look at Singapore and South Korea and even Japan, the way they dealt with COVID was significantly better than the United States and Brazil and certain parts of Europe. So China is simply implementing those same policies.
Ben, any last thoughts, any of these topics, any last plugs you want to give? And thank you for the time, of course. I mean, I really appreciate it. Always enjoy your insight, your knowledge base, and I love the work you do, Ben. Like, honestly, like you're one of the best journalists out there. Keep up the great work, man.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Now, my final word is that just what we spent most of the time talking about Latin America, I think people should keep an eye on what's going on in Brazil. It's a very interesting moment. I mean, Lula, again, he's dealing with a very complicated situation. He doesn't have a left-wing majority in either chamber of parliament. He is dealing with a very emboldened, violent, far-right opposition, clearly. But, I mean, he's been through a process where he's been pushed to the left even more by being in prison, by seeing the role of the U.S. Role in the coups against him and against Dilma, which he's talked about publicly, by the way. And Brazil is not just going to be a country that is going to integrate with Latin America and other parts of the world. I really think that Brazil is going to start being a country like on the international stage that is a significant power. Like Brazil has the ability, as the sixth most populous country with huge resources, oil, minerals, agriculture, food sovereignty. This is a country that really has the ability to be like a major pole in this multipolar world. And I think that like it's going to be very interesting to see how the US responds to that. It's going to be very interesting to see the expansion of the BRICS. In his speech, his inauguration speech, he called for strengthening the BRICS bloc. Argentina and Iran and Algeria have already applied to join. Other countries have expressed interest in joining. I mean, this is what people, when we talk about a multipolar world, it's not just like the US and China and Russia. It's also countries that had been colonized in the global south that are now going to be able, for the first time really in hundreds of years, to be able to exercise a political and economic voice on the international stage that I think is going to be really interesting. And it's going to open up more possibilities for leftist projects and anti-colonialist and even potentially revolutionary projects. So I think that in Latin America right now, it's a very exciting moment. And Brazil is going to, the fact that the largest, most populous country has now turned to the left is going to shoot, I think, adrenaline into the arm of the left internationally.
Absolutely agree, Ben. And again, what's the new sort of rebranded outlet that you have? Because it was Multipolarista, and I remember seeing your video that you published, I think, a day or two ago. about the new outlet, and I think you called it a extension of it, or I forget how you phrased it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, multipolar reason no longer exists. It morphed into it's an expansion of it's called Geopolitical Economy Report, and the idea is like I never wanted multipolar reason to just be me. I wanted to try to expand and do more coverage with a team of people. So I'm the editor, and I do run Geopolitical Economy Report, but I have more contributors and people, and also for people who are watching this like at YouTube or something, for who want to check out my channel, I also have videos that I'm going to be doing regularly that I'm not doing them. I'm going to be publishing videos with the economists, Radhika Desai, who's a great Marxist economist, and also Michael Hudson, who's a brilliant, very interesting heterodox economist. And they're going to be doing coverage. And again, it's like what we talked about today, geopolitics and economics, imperialism, understanding the economics of imperialism, which I think is important, as well as the political machinations of imperialism.
Ben, thank you for the time, man. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.